hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you, John. Let me go ahead and share my slides. Okay. Story thinking is the title of the book and the topic today. And our topic here at the cafe is using that topic to specifically dive into knowledge sharing. But we're going to have to start off with understanding what I mean by story thinking. So the backstory, if you will, of story thinking is, as all of you probably know, storytelling in the last couple of decades really has become a topic of interest, and people realizing that it's something that apparently happened around campfires thousands of years ago. It's how knowledge has moved through organizations, and recently it's moved into our corporate organizations as understanding it. And even with neuroscience, we're realizing that our brains are wired for stories. So this topic of storytelling has become very popular for very good reason. And I started realizing that as people are getting together and sharing knowledge and sharing their stories, they were talking about work. And the work that they were doing was not organized around the sense-making pattern of stories. It's organized usually around some industrial age prescriptive model that people don't understand, or they're memorizing some steps, and then they go and talk about that using a sense-making pattern of storytelling. So the aha moment was a question that I asked a while back. Why don't we study this sense-making pattern of stories and use it to work from, instead of just to talk about our work, as that work is mandated through the lens of prescriptive industrial age models. So that's the big picture. And as I was building this book out and studying stories and patterns and building out a more detailed model of stories, at one point it seemed like a nice thing. Some people might be interested in this story. And then as I started looking at what the burning platform is, what's coming at us, the fourth industrial revolution, that's now the subtitle of this book, it became more apparent that this isn't going to be a nice to have topic as the artificial intelligence, artificial automation, bots, robots, and so forth start to take over the type of work that a lot of the manual labor repeating type of work has been based around, that we're going to have to move out of our way of thinking of work as a process. So that's the backdrop to this idea of story thinking before we jumped right in. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about if you're not familiar with the fourth industrial revolution. Essentially, the first industrial revolution was based on steam and mechanical production. The second revolution was based on electricity and assembly lines. So you get the idea, there's an invention, and then we use it routinely in some way to build the idea of business around. The third revolution was based on computing and online workflow. Where we're at now, entering the fourth industrial revolution, it's primarily based on intelligence and digital connectivity. And there's some arguments about, well, every time we change from one revolution to the next, there's going to be plenty of jobs for everyone. And the example people give is, well, the guy that was putting shoes on the horse now is putting fenders on the car, that sort of thing. Though those are jobs you can train someone to do as repeated processes. That's different about what we're entering into with the fourth industrial revolutions, because those types of jobs will not be around for humans. So that's the backdrop on the four revolutions. Diving a little bit deeper into the way we think about them, with the second industrial revolution, we became accustomed to saying that everything happens within a process. And then the framework of process became our mental model of work. And you could walk into any business room and ask about the inputs or suppliers, the process, and then the outputs or customers, and sound like a very intelligent business person. Those are the right questions. But that linear process does not tell the whole story. And now with the fourth industrial revolution, we're going to need to understand that the framework of story must become our mental model of work, the way that we think about work. So let's dive in and look at what the story pattern looks like. So this is the typical story pattern. This particular model has been reviewed, several peer review academic papers. We're going to dive into a little more detail. But essentially, it starts sort of at the bottom, in a resting place. And you might recognize this from any movie you've seen. I was doing my normal routine. So movies kind of start out usually with everything in a normal state. And then something happens, some disruption, something out of the ordinary occurs. Oh, yeah. And someone will say, well, I needed some time to figure out what really happened. They look into it, and then you reach ideation. You go, okay, I've got to come up with an idea. Or maybe in a movie sense, they meet with a mentor. There's ways that we describe that. And then expectation. I worked on my plan, or in a movie sense, that's where most of the movie is. Some things happen. They have some setbacks. But essentially, at some point, if you're successful, you reach a point where you go, okay, finally worked, finally success. And then at some point after that, it's not only success, but it's the new norm. I've reached a new state of automation. I have a new and better routine going through that story. Now, we use this word automation a lot of times just to describe technology, which is not a true, it's not true to the definition of automation, which is just an automated state of mind, which I'm sure many of us have done at least 10 things today in that state of mind, sort of not really thinking about it. And that's why I talk about, we've all heard about artificial intelligence, but I like to differentiate artificial automation versus human. So this is how we think about stories. Now I'm going to take a look at what happens when we go to work. So we generally like things to make sense on a work project instead of being told, here's the steps, just follow this. What we would like to hear is something like this. We had successful operations at work, but we knew more competition was coming. We discovered a new idea that we could incorporate and created a new vision. Development took some time, but it all came together. Now operations are even better. So when work sounds like that, it makes sense for a reason, because it's following this pattern. Now, one of the things I did in the book is research on all the major change models that you can think of, and I've listed them here. The appendix lists out all 30 of them, just to map and see how different they are from this story pattern if we want to try to think about operating from a story thinking methodology. How different is it from the methods that are already out there, was the question. And they all pretty much map to this for the specific reason that they exist in different ways. And I'll show you a couple examples. They all map it to the sense-making process in some ways. You probably see some on there that you're familiar with and that you've used. I will say they all map to this sense-making process except two. And it was interesting to really discover that there's two methods of operating in two institutions that when you map them against this sense-making process, they do not align. And those two happen to be policymaking and education, which is pretty alarming, but pretty telling, and exposing the difference in why. And I think that gives us a starting place on how to go after that. So with that introduction to some of these, let me give you a few specifics. So here's the scientific method. So it's basically a process where we say make observations, ask questions, formulate a hypothesis, test predictions, draw conclusions, and then communicate results. So we're giving these steps, but why do we perform those steps? And as you'll see with the rest of the models, the steps end up making sense and doing what they need to do because they rest over top of these 6 phases of story thinking. So let's take a look at Six Sigma. Some of you may be familiar with Six Sigma, or maybe even certified in Six Sigma as a business methodology. It's an approach to reduce defects in manufacturing processes using the DMAIC thinking model, which stands for define the disruption, measure production variation from the expected, analyze, which is an investigation. And if you're certified in Six Sigma, you'll know that most of the training is really all about how to use statistical methods to find root causes, mainly in this area. And then the I in DMAIC just says improve, doesn't really give you as much detail. You can see that that's kind of spread out between what's required for ideas and development and testing. And then ending with C, or control, for making sure that we reduce production variations to less than 3 defects per million units. That's the Six Sigma measurement. So this, we say Six Sigma, that's really the in result measurement result. It's really, the thinking model is their DMAIC model. But you get the idea. You can start to map different business models, see what the pros and cons are, where anything's missing. So if you're familiar with psychology and describing how we think, there's a lot of studies around this. In fact, a book with the title Thinking Fast and Slow, that even with neuroscience now, we've measured that people have an initial reaction or a reactive thought followed by a slower thought that follows a full cycle, more of a story. I'd say, let me sleep on it, let me think it through. It's different than my initial reaction. And that's the difference between just sort of staying in the bottom part of this cycle, as I usually call the half pipe. If you're familiar with snowboarding, you would pick that out, versus the full cycle and going through the entire story. So learning, if you're familiar with David Kolb's model, he's described learning as being sort of 4 things, basically having a concrete example or experience, doing some reflective observation, looking into it, then forming an abstract conceptualization, and some active concept or experimentation, just testing it to see how that works, and then going again. And you can see how that maps. Now, this is from a change standpoint. Some of you may be familiar with Kotter's model as a change model, things to do if you want to move change through an organization. Increase urgency, a sense of urgency, form a coalition, create a strategic vision, gain support, remove obstacles, create a short-term win, leverage wins, and then also make sure that you institute the change in the culture, that it becomes the norm. When you start mapping a lot of current business models against story thinking, the story pattern, things like this appear. If you've noticed that there's something maybe missing, that you start to notice in this case, you're not sure exactly when in this pattern you're supposed to investigate root causes before creating a vision. So some of you may be familiar with Kubler-Ross, sort of emotional states that people go through related to change. So this is essentially how they would map against this cycle. Denial, anger, frustration, depression, exploration, leading to a decision to move on with an idea, eventually new hope and expectation. It appears to work. Affirmation, it's working. You have some new confidence, and later integration, which is back into a new routine and a new way of operating. And I just want to point out, I've found that a lot of consultants I run into are familiar with Kubler-Ross, and they try to describe this as the change model. That this is what, if you're going to do change in an organization, these are the emotional states you're going to go through, without realizing that these emotional states came out of a book called "And Death and Dying: Observations of a Hospice Worker." So if that's what you want to bring into an organization, it might be self-fulfilling. But I can prove to you this isn't the change model, because if you won the lottery today, I'd like you to picture you winning the lottery, the multi-million-dollar lottery today, and tell me if these are the emotions you would go through. Probably not. So I want to just make that clear about the difference as we start to dive in and understand all the models that are out there and as they map against story thinking. Okay, so obviously I'm not going to go through all 30 today. That gives you an idea of some of the work that was done in comparisons. Some people at some point to go, this sort of makes sense, but how do you know there's 6 phases of this change and story cycle? Maybe there's 7 or 8. I want to share, there's a lot of detail and some academic papers around this and other research that has been done. So I can't go too deeply in that, but just wanted to give you an idea, the concept that these 6 phases are generated. They're created from mental mindsets and beliefs that we have. So you probably heard, it either works or doesn't work. But those are, first of all, those are workability beliefs, because what you think does work, I might think doesn't work. And thirdly, the third belief is could work. That's really where a lot of projects are are happening. We're in a state of could work as we're moving through a project. And then on the other ring inside this, looking at questioning, reflective, reactive, a lot of times we talk about just the duality as something is reactive or reflective. But in the study of languages and the fact that a lot of them end their sentences with an exclamation point or a period or a question mark, that they're telling us something about the mode that we're in as we're describing what we're describing in that sentence. And it's interesting that even with the Spanish language, it's so important to know that up front, that they'll just put the upside down question mark up front. So, you know, as you're entering that knowledge, what mode you're in. And so these combinations, I won't read through the right-hand side, but as you can see, I won't read all of them, but essentially when you think of automation, that simply means that we're in a mindset of does work and reactive. We at least have a belief that what we're doing works, and we want to be in a sort of reactive, mindless mode. And that's a good thing at times for efficiency, proficiency, and pumping out work. But it's different than, let's say, ideation, sort of in a questioning and could work mindset. So these are the mindsets that are driving story thinking. Now, if we want to have change, what I also did is in looking at all of the change methods, looking at best practices across the board, how would you come up with a change method that would align to story thinking? And it's called I let 'em. So it's the first letter of each step. So what steps is the most important to perform for each phase of story thinking? So the first one is identify opportunities. Looking at appreciative inquiry and a study on that is you can acknowledge problems, but too many times we focus on problems and not the opportunity. It's the entrepreneur sees the opportunity in the disruption, whereas an analyst or problem solver is looking at the problem and is not going to be inventive. And it's inventive skills that we're going to need as the fourth industrial revolution comes along. So the second step is look into gap analyses, not analysis. It means basically not just root causes, but root factors, because many times there's a perfect storm of things that come together and happen. It's not a single thing. Envision solution, develop solution, evaluate trueness, and then finally back to our arrested state of automation. Reactive does work. And we want to maintain a status quo there. With any project, it's the same thing in maintaining. It involves people, process, and technology. So we want to think about how we're maintaining people, process, and technology, which means relationships as it comes to people as well. Now, this is one cycle through. Obviously, some projects, some changes require a multi-generational approach. So there's ways to think through breaking up projects so we don't have change fatigue. That's what happens if you try to take on too much at one time. So there's a way of thinking through that as well. So that's the prescriptive way of thinking through this. Now, as it relates to knowledge sharing, let's say that we are meeting with a group of people and no one's given us any advice on how to do that. We're going to have a knowledge cafe. Cafe sounds nice. We've got coffee and we start talking. And what normally happens is people say, here's some things that I do, and I can show you how to do it. Great. Tell me what you do. All right, I'll show you what I do. This is what I do. This is what work looks like. Okay, thanks. And we've had our knowledge sharing. But with story thinking, it's going to help us break this out a little better to maybe approach it a little bit more broadly to say, you know what, in addition to that, here's some risks and issues we have and what we do to prepare and plan for them and react when they happen. What do you do when that happens? Or here's some things we're looking into for discovery and analysis, the way that we're diving in and researching something, but also just broadly in discovery. Here's some things we do, including noontime knowledge cafes, discovering new things. Here's some things we do. What do you do as a way of thinking about using story thinking to frame our knowledge sharing? So with ideation, here's some ideas we're considering and our idea process. Tell me about yours. Here's some things we're developing and our progress. Here's what's slowing down our progress. Here's what's working. Tell me about what you're developing, what you're working on that's not complete, not part of the routine yet. Tell me about your projects. And then here's some evidence-based resources. Here's where we go when we want to know the answer or best practice, at least for now. What's your list? So what story thinking does is it allows us to have a better experience in knowledge sharing that's not just stuck in one place. And so essentially, here's some knowledge sharing strategies based on story thinking. So individually, as I just discussed, be sure to include knowledge from all 6 phases. But also teaming, if you've got a group of people, you can break them up and say, use color codes to find someone with your same phase interest. So let's say my interest is really right now getting something done, increasing productivity, bringing in some type of automation, robots, or whatever it takes to do that. And I find someone with another green tag. They could be an entirely different industry. They could work for NASCAR in the car pit, turning the cars around in a few seconds. And I could still learn something from them from that framework. And then thirdly, from a teaming standpoint, use color codes to find someone with your opposite phase interest. Why would I want to do that? So if I'm really in a productive state of mind, the last person I want to talk to is an ideation person, because they're coming up with ideas, and most of them sort of out of scope. Some of them don't even make sense to me, and I don't have time for that. I mean, those people, well, actually, we're those people, right? We're a lunchtime knowledge cafe talking about new ideas. So we're the people that are coming up with ideas, learning new things, and why would I want to put those types of people together? So what another part of research is very interesting, looking at emotional tension. You're going to have tension in an organization, and there's ways to actually harness it and generate energy for change by looking at opposites. So, in the ideation automation opposites, we need to keep our feet on the ground and also reach for the stars. These are always and also type relationships. It's not just a cyclic or linear type of relationship. We have these opposite relationships that generate tension. And by thinking about knowledge sharing through this lens, it's going to allow us to put people together that wouldn't normally talk. And instead of working in a vacuum as someone that's performing ideation, they're talking to someone that's running something currently right now and can generate some ideas that might actually work. Okay, so one last thought on knowledge sharing as it relates to story thinking is a lot of times we think of knowledge sharing as something only people do. And in fact, the name Knowledge Cafe, you kind of picture, people with coffee. But this is saying, look, let's consider our knowledge management systems in our organization as we're thinking about knowledge sharing. So for example, an answer system, an affirmation, that's the answer for now. An answer system can be a simple FAQ page, a frequently asked question, or even an intelligent bot, but it serves a different purpose than the collaboration system up in ideation, which holds a multitude of opinions in addition to the final answer. In fact, you can look across the board and go, well, there's a risk system that some department has. There's a discovery system that another department has. How are these systems as a strategy working together? So a knowledge sharing strategy should include KM system connectivity, which doesn't need to be soldering wires together. This can just be saying, are we making sure that the heads of the people that run those systems are talking, and that we're pulling them together as part of knowledge sharing and what they're learning from those systems and passing on to the next system. And another thing it might make us stop and reconsider is like in an organization, do we even have all of these systems? Is there a discovery system somewhere in our organization? Because if we're missing one of these, then that's going to be the spot that's going to keep this continuous improvement cycle from continuing to move. So some thoughts about knowledge sharing with story thinking. So with that, that's our quick introduction today on story thinking, specifically in part 1 on change. There's also a part on learning and leadership that I hope to explore with you at a later date.